This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
We know the old adage in sports, Father Time is undefeated, and it's true. So we knew there was going to come a time when Barry Sanders' career was going to come to a screeching halt. But that summer in 1999 was not the expected date. It wasn't the expected time, and it shook not just the Detroit media, but it shook the whole sports world. And the number of what-ifs, what could have been, as well as a collective look back on the career, hasn't stopped. It's been 17 years, and we're still talking about the man for a reason. And on today's show, we give you a very special edition of Hindsight. We're calling it Hindsight 20 for 20, Barry Sanders. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to the podcast. As always, I'm a proud member of the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. It's not just me. You've got Doc and Jock. You've got Tigers Talk. It's a host. It's a litany, a cast and crew that all of you, I know, have been tuning into. So do yourself a favor. If you haven't, do just that, as well as subscribe. Go to iTunes. You can go to Podbay. It's all there. We have a few quick notes that we're going to get into. And then, yes, the meat and potatoes of today's show is just that. Hindsight 20 for 20. It's a segment that we're going to try to do here and there. There's a ton of history for the Lions. Some good, unfortunately, a lot bad. I can see the 0-16 season being talked about, Calvin Johnson, etc. But we're leading off this segment. Yes, it is an ode. It's homage to the 30 for 30 segment, phenomenal on ESPN. It's called Hindsight 20 for 20. Episode 1 of this is Barry Sanders. So let's talk about a few quick news and notes for the Detroit Lions before we get into this. We're going to have a few people joining us. Kent Lee Platte from Private Detroit. We have Mallory Sr. joining us. So it's a star-studded show, to say the least. You don't have to hear my voice rambling on for the whole deal. So quick news and notes. Cole Wick, tight end. Yes, incarnate world, whatever, the college that none of us heard of until he got drafted by the Lions. So far, so good for the young man. This was a listener question that we had at the beginning of last show. A little bit worried about the tight end situation. This was right before Eric Ebron returned to practice. And yes, we still have Brandon Pettigrew being hurt and recovering from the ACL. This was shortly after Tim Wright. So one of the questions that we had that we tackled last week was the tight end spot, it being thin, what we will do to kind of remedy that. Cole Wick was one of the guys I talked about. A lot of hype for him in terms of his blocking and his toughness. They gave him a very big bonus, which to me means when you're an undrafted free agent, you get good money in terms of what's available. When you get a big chunk of that pool like him and big Chase Ferris, offensive lineman from Ohio State, that means to me that you are potentially in the future plans of that team. And so far, so good for Cole Wick. He's showing the ability to actually catch the ball. We already know he's a big guy that can block. Supposedly made some pretty good catches. So let's keep an eye out for him, because after Eric Ebron and Brandon Pettigrew, there is a third tight end spot. And at this point, I think Cole Wick is the odds-on favorite to land it. The second news piece that came out, a lot of people talking about Theo Riddick running the ball more this year, him being a bigger role in the rush attack. I'm not for it, man. I mean, if it's not broke, don't try to fix it. I feel like Theo Riddick has been so good as a specialized player, and I'm sure he wants more carries, but, you know, I'm looking at game film and I'm looking at the history of some of the other players. I'm more comfortable with Abdullah getting the lion's share, pun intended, than Theo Riddick, being, the main guy in terms of receiving in the slot as well as catching out the backfield. But in terms of other guys, getting carries after Amir Abdullah, I'm liking Stephen Ridley a little bit more. And we still have to wait and see what Zach Zenner is going to do. The new guy we just drafted, Washington, as well as Theo Riddick, to me are glorified wide receivers. Both Daryl and Theo good at what they do. And the fact that Theo's getting an opportunity to run the ball more, I'm not saying I'm totally against it, but I kind of feel like if it's not broke, don't fix it. And there's plenty of guys in front of him that are better at running, whereas he is one of the best at catching the ball out of the backfield and even going into the slot. One of the best catching running backs in the game. Don't try to change it up too much. We have a system that I think will go really well if you're letting Abdullah get some carries as, your primary back with Ridley being a power runner center. And yeah, Theo, we can chime you in a time or two in terms of running the ball. The last piece, they said don't count out Dan Orlovsky. He's still living, he's still breathing. I don't think anyone is expecting Jake Rudock to come off the bat and be the number 2, the backup. I know I don't. Dan Orlovsky still should be your number 2. They're going to run with 3 quarterbacks. And so, articles coming out talking about Dan Orlovsky still have some fight in him. I'm not expecting Jake Rudock to take his spot this year. I'm expecting him to challenge it. It would be cool if he was. That means he's far along, but Dan Orlovsky's been in the league a long time. Jake Rudock is, pretty new, and he had his flaws even while at Michigan. So I'm not expecting, Orlovsky to be counted out. I expect him to be Stafford's backup, with Rudock having the potential to be that backup the following year. But this year, Dan Orlovsky's spot, it should be safe, and it will be safe. All right, we touched on some of those news and notes. It's now time to dig into the segment. It's the segment you've all been waiting for, that you've wanted to hear. Well, I'm looking forward to, because Barry Sanders, man, I can give you story after story, but I'll just start from the very beginning. And my whole deal with the Lions, it was the one sport that I always say I just kind of gravitated toward on my own. On the one end, you had, and my dad always, all the sports he got me into, but I would say baseball was the one that he was very instrumental, the most instrumental in me getting into. Him being a phenomenal baseball player himself, him watching it. I used to always sit there. We would enjoy the Tigers. They were lean years. And so in those lean years, we kind of had secondary teams. I was always a fan of the Atlanta Braves. He was a fan of the Yankees at one point. And then, other teams. And so baseball, I attribute to him. Basketball, I got to give credit to my sister, Marlena, who was a huge fan of the Pistons, but also a fan of the New York Knicks. And me being the irritating younger brother, I decided to go with the Indiana Pacers, and I've been a fan of Reggie Miller ever since. Football was the one that I kind of feel like I gravitated toward on my own. I remember the Super Bowls. I would go, watch it with my dad, the Cowboys and the Bills, et cetera, et cetera. But football just kind of was that special relationship that I had with it on a personal level. And Barry Sanders, if you're my age, if you're in that 30-year range, and if you're a avid Lions fan, many of us are, I think Barry deserves a lot of credit, because although we had some good years, NFC Championship game, there were a lot of lean years. And the thing we always were able to hold of high esteem, to pat ourselves on the back on was, yes, number 20, Barry Sanders. Phenomenal doesn't even do justice if we think about who he is. And I'm going to try not to gush, because I could just gush about Barry for the whole show, but I'm going to try to give you some aspects and some things about him, good and bad, as well as some opinions from others. Like I said, you might know him as Math Bomb. Extraordinary on Twitter, extraordinary on Pride Detroit. Kent Lee is going to join us, as well as my father, Jerry Mallory Sr. But I am going to gush a little bit. Just watching him run, and we're getting at the point where, people kind of come and go, names come and go. Even the great Calvin Johnson. I coach a little league football team. And for me coming up, if I'm mentioning a receiver, it was always Jerry Rice. It was some Herman Moore. As I got a little bit older into my teens, it was Randy Moss. And I'm teaching these guys, the art of catching with two hands, because everybody wants to be not Calvin Johnson. They want to be Odell Beckham Jr. When they're mentioning something on that field, these kids range from 6 to 14. They're talking about Odell Beckham Jr., not Calvin, who, this is the hometown, right? These are kids in the Metro Detroit area, but it's Odell Beckham Jr. that they're talking about. Calvin just left. And maybe if I was a little league coach 5 years ago, Calvin would be mentioned. But it kind of shows just how the perception of how, your old news, what's hot now. I think Barry kind of transcends that. When you think of running backs, and certainly your modern running backs, Adrian Peterson and Todd Gurley, they're going to get love, LaDainian Tomlinson. I still think Barry Sanders is the standard. I still hear kids talk about Barry, and they're 6 years old on this team. They weren't even born anywhere close to when Barry Sanders played. They're 10 years old, and Barry is still the guy that's mentioned. And I know it's Detroit, but we're also in Detroit, Metro Detroit. And some of these guys even, have seen Calvin Johnson play, who is one of the best receivers of the last 10 years. But they're not talking about Calvin in Metro Detroit. They're talking about Odell Beckham Jr. And so it's something special about Barry that he kind of transcends time. And that's what Kent's going to talk about, of how Barry's impact on the team and even the fans still to this day, 17 years later, still exists. I was going to give you my favorite run. That was going to be one of the little things I was going to do. It's hard to pick one. He's got some classic ones against the Dallas Cowboys where, 5 guys converge. They all end up on the ground and Barry's running. You look at highlights, do yourself a favor and YouTube Barry Sanders. And I don't care if you've seen the highlights 100 times. I have too. Do yourself a favor and YouTube it and you'll enjoy it. So many good moments. For me, the 2,000-yard season, that was big. It was in 1997. There's a reason why the Honolulu blue and silver was painted in my room. I had the poster of Barry, and I put up the 2053 stickers on that poster. It was bittersweet. It was a game in which there was a huge injury to Reggie Brown. Excuse me if I get any names wrong. I don't have a ton of notes. I really want to speak from the heart on this one. It was against the New York Jets. It was a bittersweet game that he surpassed the 2000. But from a personal level, it was always one of those deals where, who was going to be the next guy to get it? Because it's a record that even to this day, not a lot of guys have surpassed that. A handful, Jamal Lewis, Adrian Peterson. There isn't a really big list. CJ2K, Chris Johnson. And so you really appreciate that, yes, this was another guy that surpassed it. But I want to talk about that moment in 1999 for a second here. And after I talk about that, we'll move on and hear what Kent has to say on the impact that Barry has even down to this day. And this was before Twitter. This was before the internet was booming. And so a lot of times, news pieces didn't get circulated as quick, but this one seemed to circulate. Whether it was on the radio station or, I don't know, if it was Bernie Smilovich or, I don't know, maybe Van Earl Wright. I'm giving you some throwback names. Whoever was, the sports guy at that time, in your local news, 2, 4, and 7. It came out quick, right before training camp, that Barry sends this fax and he retires. And you're like, what? 30 years old, he's getting older, but still young enough. The season before he ran for 1,400 yards. The season before that was the 2,000-yard season. And you start to ask why. There were rumors that he didn't like Bobby Ross. He didn't like the fact that they wanted to run more of a ground and pound. They wanted to use a fullback. There's rumors about, the Lions organization, and perhaps he wanted to play somewhere else. Maybe in Miami. That was the hot team, remember? Perhaps he wanted to play for the Miami Dolphins. Well, no matter how you slice it, it was a big moment in Detroit sports. And I think for me, it was the beginning of a series of heartbreaks when he leaves. And then, Grant Hill, you fast forward to, we definitely have tough losses, but losing players that you look up to. And, Ben Wallace was next. When a guy leaves, whether it's free agency or they're traded, it's a blow. And that was one of the first ones that really hit home for a lot of people my age. I was at that time 14 years old. And it was actually a moment that, and I talked about this in the podcast earlier and during the actual season where we had David Hull, the Hatchet Man from 97-1. It was a moment that really brought me and him together and a group of guys together because my first year in high school as a freshman in 1999, I told this story before, but maybe there's some new listeners. I'm in that lunchroom and I know no one because the middle school I went to, no one ended up attending Cass Tech High in Detroit, Michigan. So I'm kind of looking and, trying to find a group, and it's always an awkward moment. And I hear some people talking about Barry Sanders, and it was David, the Hatchet Man Hull, and a group of other people. So I said, this is where I need to be. This is the lunch table I need to go to. And we would chop it up about sports from that point forward. And my initial reaction was anger. I was upset. How could you? So much more on the table, so much left in the tank. But then the reasons started to come out. Why? And as we look and see a trend now with guys that are starting to retire early, leaving, their life intact, you don't blame a guy as much now. They make their money, they contribute to their team, and they walk away, while they can still walk, while they still have a fully functional brain. So many reasons as to why Barry may have left. But what I'm going to do right now is turn over into Kent. Kent Lee Platte. I know I'm probably saying it wrong. Platey. I'm sorry. We talk on a semi-regular basis via texting on our little Slack app from Pride of Detroit. But you may know him as Math Bomb. He's on Pride of Detroit. He gave a very good, concise answer as to the impact that Barry Sanders still has on the Detroit Lions as we're removed from him as an organization and as a group of fans. So let's listen to see what Kent has to say as he really gives a concise but profound answer as the Lions still looking for that Barry Sanders type of player. Let's give a listen.
Kent Lee Platte, Pride of Detroit, and I just wanted to mention one thing that I thought about Barry Sanders and what he means to the people of Detroit, and of course the Detroit Lions fans. One of the things that always struck me with Barry is that people don't think of him just for what he did on the field, but for how he carried himself on the field and off the field. Whenever we had somebody that we brought in to be the next big star in Detroit, it wasn't so much whether you wanted them to play well, which you did, of course, but it was how you wanted them to carry themselves. And I think Calvin Johnson was probably the perfect embodiment of that. He was somebody that didn't taunt other players. He didn't celebrate too much when he got touchdowns. That's something that Barry brought to Detroit is whenever we have somebody come in, it's that certain level of humility that you expect them to carry themselves with. And you don't really get that with most other teams. You have a lot of other teams where they expect them to be the big loudmouth, brash type person. You want them to be the big superstar with the big name. But Detroit expects a level of humility, and recently we've had that with guys like DeAndre Levy and Ziggy Ansah. Guys that carry themselves with a little bit of swagger, but not so much that they're arrogant and that rubs wrong on fans. I think it's part of the reason that a guy like Ndamukong Suh didn't have as much love from the fan base, because he had that type of abrasive personality. But I think that's the biggest draw that we've had from Barry Sanders in Detroit, and what he still means to us is that level of expectation we have for our players just to carry themselves professionally, both on and off the field. It's something I don't think you have in any other fan base.
Like we said, you can see Math Bomb, Kent Lee Platte on privatetrade.com. We want to thank you for joining us on this segment, this very special 20 for 20, Hindsight 20 for 20 segment. Now, one aspect that I want to talk about Barry, and it's a negative, it's two things. Number one, yes, he leads the league in rushing year after year. Now he's number 3 on the all-time list, but he does have a stat that many of us do remember, and it's not a positive. He is the all-time leader in negative yardage. It's because for every highlight that Barry gave you where he, juked 9 people and ran for 30 yards, there was a time or two where, he would run east and west but be caught. He would run east or west, and ultimately, it would be a loss of yards, and he has plenty of those. The other thing, though, was the playoffs, and his playoff record in terms of rushing, it wasn't good. And so you start to wonder, was it because of the weather conditions being worse in the playoffs, him starting to wear down? But I'll give you his playoff stats. Now, in 1991, it was solid, nothing to write home about. He played 2 games. He had 113 yards and a touchdown, average of 5 yards a carry. Pretty good. The next one was probably his best playoff performance in 1993, is where he had 27 carries, 169 yards. Very good game. After that, it gets ugly. 1994, he had 13 carries for -1 yard. 1995, 10 carries, 40 yards. And then 1997, 18 carries for 65 yards, only 3.6 yards per carry. And so that was one of his biggest knocks, the fact that he would dance around and sometimes it wouldn't always be effective, so he would get caught, and then that his playoff, record was not that good. So you would start to wonder, is it because of the weather, or, what was the reason behind it? No matter how you want to slice it, it was concerning. It was something that we had to deal with. And, ultimately, I think it's one of his biggest knocks. The fact that, when we needed him the most, for whatever reason, he was not there. But it is a small sample size. The Lions, unfortunately weren't in the playoffs year after year, and he didn't have a ton of time to kind of improve with that. Now, the next point I want to talk about is the record, because the record was going to be put so far out of reach that no one would be able to touch it. Now, Barry Sanders, he ended his career 15,269 yards. That's number 3 all time. Still, number 1, as we know, is Emmitt Smith, 18,355 yards. Walter Payton had the record for quite some time, 16,726 yards. So, is anyone going to come close to those numbers? I really have my doubts now. You look at the way today's NFL is played, with injuries, with running back by committee. Current players that are, kind of close. Number 15 all time is Frank Gore with just over 12,000 yards. Not going to happen, man. His career is winding down 3-4 more seasons. Adrian Peterson is number 17 with 11,675 yards. Injuries, I think, have kind of derailed his chances. He's on the wrong side of 30 now. I'll say maybe another 4 more years. Even at another 4 more years at 1,500 yards, that would still put him at 17,000-ish. So he won't get the record. Now, what about Barry Sanders? And why do I say the record would have been put so far out of reach? Well, it's simple. You look at his 10 seasons, he averaged a little bit over 1,500 yards per season. At 30 years old, we know that there may have been some regression, but he was always healthy. That's another point we have to realize. Let's use Emmitt Smith as an example. Emmitt Smith played until he was 35, and he probably played a season or two too long. But even after 30, he had 3 seasons of over 1,000 yards. He had 2 really productive years, one at 1,397 in yardage, one at 1,203, and then one at 1,021. If Barry played as long as Emmitt Smith, so he played until 35 and he had 5 more years, I'm not even going to give him 1,500 because that's cheating. That would put him at 7,500 more yards and pretty much put him at like 23,000 yards on the career, 5,000 more than Emmitt for number 1. I mean, the record's just out of reach. What if he, though, rushed for like 1,200 yards? That's a little bit more realistic. 1,500 yards, your first 10 years, your last, 5 seasons at 1,200. Well, that would have gave him 6,000 more yards, and that would have put him at 21,269. About 3,000 more yards than Emmitt Smith, whose record I don't know if anyone's ever going to catch. Let's drop it down even another notch. Let's say Barry Sanders only averaged 1,000 yards his last 5 years. I think personally he would have averaged somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 on average his last 5 years. Let's say only 1,000 yards. That would give him an extra 5,000. That would put him at 20,269 for a career. A little bit under 2,000 yards over Emmitt Smith. Good for number 1. And in my estimation, since I don't think anyone will surpass Emmitt Smith because the way the NFL is played now, Barry at 20,000. If he would have played, an average career and, the health was there, we know there were other reasons why he left, I'm thinking the record would have been his alone, and nobody would have come close. All right, guys, at this time, we have the special guest. It's my father, Jerry Mallory Sr., someone who was able to see some of the greats play. Your Eric Dickersons, your O.J. Simpsons, Billy Sims, Walter Payton. He gives his spiel on Barry Sanders, as in typical Jerry Mallory fashion, breaking down the Lions like only we can. Very special guest. Let's have a listen.
As promised, guys, we have a very special guest. I talked about it on last show, and I'm here to deliver. We have Jerry Mallory Sr., the father of me. He's on here. Like I said, we've been doing this sports thing for a long time, so he's here to join us today. Hey, what's going on, Dad?
Hey, what's happening, man?
Nothing much. It's an honor to have you on the show. I mean, talking about Barry Sanders, we had to get a wide perspective. I couldn't just have myself on here, so I got a couple of special guests, you being one of them. So we just want to start off. You've been a Lions fan. You've been watching them for a long time. You saw Billy Sims and, some of the Lions greats. But when Barry Sanders came, what was your reaction to when he first came and as his career progressed?
Okay. Barry, he was awesome. Coming in, he was great. He was a fantastic runner from the beginning to the end.
You know what? And he really was. I think when you have a chance to see some of the guys, like, people compared him to Emmitt Smith and, different ones. Barry was just a step above all of those guys, I would say.
Right. I say so. Emmitt Smith couldn't carry his gym shoes.
I agree. Emmitt had I think Barry had an okay line, but Emmitt had that luxury. He had that was the first offensive line where you saw just several guys 300 pounds plus. And, Barry didn't have the talent around him, but he still got it done. So we flash forward to, 1999, and he retires. And I remember we had a long conversation talking about it. We were all shocked. What was your reaction when he retired? I mean, he still had some years left, but he called it quits.
Yeah, it was a total shock. I couldn't see why that man left the game when he did. Leaving at that time in his career, he still had 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 more years to run.
Yep.
I don't know why he did that.
Easily. I mean, he was never really hurt, so it wasn't a big injury thing. But, all the stories came out as to why he left. Do you think it has something to do with management, and Bobby Ross came in and, supposedly he wasn't happy with Bobby Ross and they started using the fullback. Do you think it has something to do with the Lions organization, or maybe he was just sick of football altogether?
I think he was sick of the game altogether because he could have went and played for somebody else as good as he was.
That's true.
But he just chose to retire.
And that's like when we talk about Calvin, some people wonder if it's the Lions or if it's just the game. It's the same case with Calvin. If he really wanted to play somewhere else, the Lions could have facilitated that. They could have made it happen. They could have got assets for it. But although these guys have something left in the tank, they decide to call it quits. Now,
they choose to walk away from the game.
Yeah, and you know what? There's something to be said for walking away and you still have, health. And you still are able to move around. These guys, there's life outside of football. And we know them as football players, so that's what we care about them the most. But they have family, friends. Some of them have kids. And I think that's kind of the trend you're seeing now with football altogether, Dad, where guys are retiring earlier and earlier because of the brain injuries. And, the game is so fast now, people are starting to do what Barry Sanders did 16, 17 years ago.
Away.
Yep, walk away.
Just walk away. Yeah, it's becoming a trend in the NFL, and I don't know. I can't say it's a bad trend because the guys are walking away with the money and with their health. So it's a twofold a good thing.
It is, and they're making so much money now. That's another aspect. 20 years ago they were making good money. A big time player would make their contract would be worth $10 million or $15 million. Now, big time player's contract is worth upwards of $100 million, $125 million. So, they're making they call it generational money. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're making money it's going to be for them and generation after generation. So, the last question we want to ask you, and it's probably an easy question, but we're going to just end it with this. Do you think the Lions will ever get a player as important, as good, as dominant, as special as Barry Sanders?
It's a hard question. All I can say is I'm hoping they can. I'm hoping that they do. But will they ever get that? I'm not sure. That's a tough one, man.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, since Barry retired, and not just for the Lions, in the whole NFL, I really haven't seen anyone like Barry. There's been some great running backs, LaDainian Tomlinson. Adrian Peterson's real good. He's probably, one of the closest to in terms of dominance. But in the whole league, we haven't seen the Barry. So to say that we'll see another one and he'll be on the Lions, that's kind of hard.
That's kind of hard, yeah. Man, a running back like Barry Sanders, man. And like you said about the Dallas boy, he had great big offensive guards in front of him, 300 pounds apiece.
Yep.
Barry had nobody, and he ran the way he did.
He did.
He was just an awesome running back in the game.
Yep. And
maybe one of the best I've ever seen run.
Yeah, and then here's the thing too, because me being younger, some of the other greats I didn't get a chance to see. You were able to see Walter Payton and some of these other greats, Jim Brown and different ones. Would you put Barry? I mean, I can only say if he was better than those guys, but I didn't actually see them. But you saw some of these guys, Gale Sayers, some of the O.J. Simpson, Eric Dickerson. Where would you put Barry amongst some of the guys you actually watched game after game?
I put him right in the same class as those running backs, a supreme running back. All of them were great in their own right. But Barry, when he ran just as well as each one of those guys did.
There you go, and that's from someone that actually watched it. Like I said, this is a cool show. I've been able to have several guests, but this is definitely the best one. Like I was telling the guys on the podcast last week, we did this, 13, 14, 15 years ago with the wrestling tip. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so, the fact that
absolutely,
we flash forward 2016, we're still doing it. It's a pretty good show. So don't be a stranger. Join us again. I know you got plenty of Lions to talk about. That's where I get my love of the game from. So we're looking forward to having you on here again. Thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry.
We want to thank Jerry Mallory Sr. for joining us. Real big treat having my dad on there, and I'm hoping to bring him on the show another time or two. A few closing thoughts on this whole Barry Sanders thing. There's a myth that I wanted to debunk, and it was how the narrative right after he left was, it's the Lions. The Lions ruined him. All of the losing got to him. And that may be a factor, okay? I don't think it didn't play a role at all. But when you look at the trends in the NFL now, guys leaving, when they still have some health, when they kind of lose that love for the game, but they've made their mark. I think Barry was just ahead of the curve. And that was kind of what me and Senior were talking about. I'm not saying the Lions had nothing to do with it, that Bobby Ross had nothing to do with it, but to say that's the number one reason that he really wanted to play in Miami. And if you look at the support that Barry has given the Lions organization in the years after, he's been a company guy through and through. You would think a guy that kind of had some real negative feelings toward a team and kind of felt like a team forced him to retire and, forced him to choose to retire, et cetera, et cetera. You would kind of think that he would not be as active, as a member of the Lions legacy that he is. And so I kind of wanted to debunk that myth that the Lions broke him down and that was the reason why he retired. I think it may have been a factor, but a small one. And I think ultimately, his love for the game as a whole started to wane and he wanted to keep his health and he was ready for the next chapter in his life, similar to Calvin Johnson. Barry versus Emmett, it's something that we will always talk about. I think that, Emmett said it best, man. You ask him, he'll say it. Barry was better than me. Emmett did have that luxury of one of the first offensive lines were 1 through 5. They were just these big, huge, athletic guys, 300-pounders. And even the current Cowboys kind of modeling that athletic yet big and talented offensive line they have today on the original offensive line in the glory years for the boys. And so I don't really think it was a comparison. I mean, you look at the skill set, speed, power, escapability. Emmett was good and whatnot, but really no comparison. I will say this. I think our offensive line at times it gets bashed during the Barry years, and it wasn't the best, but we had some highlights. Lomas Brown was a 7-time Pro Bowler, and, you had some Jeff Hardings in there, a little Mike Compton. It wasn't as bad as people like to say, in my opinion. But overall, if you're comparing the two, I mean, there is no contest. Emmett had more tools, had more weapons, and definitely had more support and more blocking. And that, and that's the end of it, man. Will we ever see another guy like Barry? I'll say never say never. Probably when Jim Brown came around, people thought that there would never be a running back of his ilk. Gale Sayers, Walter Payton, and so there probably will be another Barry. Will it be on our team? We'll have to wait and see on that. But no matter how you slice it, this man, he leaves the game 17 years ago. He left the game with so much more in the tank, but we're still talking about him. We still love Barry Sanders. We still wish, I'm not going to say we still wish he would come back. I think that's finally over and done with. But he's still a Detroit icon, a Detroit legend. And on a week where, we've had some monumental, legendary sports guys pass, Gordie Howe, who was a Detroit legend, Muhammad Ali, we have a living legend. Do yourself a favor and appreciate him while he's here. Let's not sit back and pine over Barry when it's, over and done, not to speak morbidly. Let's enjoy the man for who he was, giving us in some of those lean years something to cheer for, something to root for. And you talk about a highlight reel, I don't care what team you rooted for. Barry Sanders is the ultimate highlight reel. And so Todd Gurley, Adrian Peterson, LaDainian Tomlinson, you guys are good, okay? But Barry, whole different level. I want you guys' input. This is the first segment, first show in terms of the 20 for 20 deal. We had to start it off with Barry, but there's plenty of more topics to talk about. I mean, you've got Calvin Johnson, the 0-16 season, Ndamukong Suh. I want to hear your input. Who would you like to hear on a future segment, a future 20 for 20, hindsight 20 for 20 segment? The first one is out the way. Barry Sanders, Saint Barry, as I like to call him, the GOAT, the greatest of all time. Enjoy giving you my spiel as a young man, the pain of him leaving, the joys of seeing him play, and hearing from Kent and Mr. Jerry Mallory Sr. giving their takes on the one and only Barry Sanders. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. As always, I can be found at Jerry Mallory NFL on Twitter, as well as PrivateDetroit.com, as well as Count That Baby in the File, covering the Pistons right here on the Detroit Sports Podcasting Network. Until next Monday, this has been Jerry Mallory. Thank you for listening, and we're out of here. Until next time, peace.